October 12th, 1943. The hills surrounding the Italian town of Cassino Etch of Distantode with the Thunder artillery. Smoke drifted across the valley like morning fog. But this wasn't weather. This was war. And somewhere in those rolling hills, Staff Sergeant Michael O'Malley crouched behind his 105mm howitzer, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the elevation wheel, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Rage. For 3 days, his unit had been taking orders to hold fire. 3 days of watching German positions strengthen while American infantry bled in the valleys below. 3 days of radio silence from command while enemy reinforcements poured in like water through a broken dam. The official word was simple. Wait for coordinates, follow protocol, do not engage without authorization. But Michael O'Malley had seen enough. Through his field glasses, he could make out the German observation post on Hill 394. The same post that had been directing devastating fire onto American positions for weeks. The same post that had cost his unit 12 good men just the day before. The same post that was about to receive visitors whether command approved or not. What happened next would violate every rule in the artillery manual. It would bypass the chain of command, ignore established protocol, and potentially court-martial the man who pulled the trigger. But it would also destroy an entire German battalion in less than 4 minutes and change the course of the Italian campaign forever. This is the story of how one man's decision to disobey orders became one of the most devastating artillery strikes of World War II. A story of precision, rebellion, and the kind of calculated fury that turns the tide of war. Staff Sergeant Michael Patrick O'Malley wasn't supposed to be an artilleryman. He grew up in South Boston, the son of a dock worker who spent his evenings rebuilding engines in a cramped garage behind their tenement building. Michael learned to measure angles by watching his father align pistons. He learned patience by holding flashlights while grease-stained hands performed mechanical surgery on broken transmissions. By the time he was 16, he could diagnose engine trouble by sound alone and calculate gear ratios in his head faster than most men could work them out on paper. When Pearl Harbor changed everything, Michael enlisted with dreams of becoming a pilot. The Army had different plans. One look at his mechanical aptitude scores and his uncanny ability to judge distances, and they shipped him straight to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the artillery trained. He hated it at first. The rigid hierarchy, the endless calculations, the way every shot had to be approved by someone who wasn't looking through the scope. But gradually, something clicked. Artillery wasn't just about following orders. It was about understanding ballistics, wind patterns, and target analysis. It was about taking complex mathematical problems and solving them under pressure while people died waiting for your answer. Michael discovered he had a gift for it. Not just the technical aspects, but the intuitive understanding of how shells move through space, how terrain affected trajectory, how to read the landscape like a three-dimensional map. By the time his unit shipped out to North Africa, then Sicily, and finally to the muddy hills of Italy, Michael had developed a reputation. Other crews called him the Professor because of his habit of scribbling calculations on every scrap of paper he could find. His commanding officers called him reliable. His fellow soldiers called him the man you wanted behind the gun when things got desperate. What none of them fully understood was that Michael O'Malley had also developed something else during those long months of combat. A deep, burning hatred for inefficiency, for bureaucracy that cost lives, for orders that made sense in a classroom but fell apart in the chaos of battle. The Italian campaign had been a grinding, bloody affair from the beginning. Every hill was a fortress. Every valley was a killing field. The Germans had spent months preparing their defences, turning ancient towns into modern death traps. They knew the terrain intimately and used it with surgical precision. American forces had been pushing north for weeks, paying for every mile with blood and exhaustion. The weather was turning cold, supply lines were stretched thin, and morale was beginning to crack under the weight of constant casualties and minimal progress. Michael's artillery unit, Charlie Battery of the 133rd Field Artillery Battalion, had been positioned on a ridge overlooking the Casino Valley for almost a week. Their mission was fire support for advancing infantry, but that support required constant coordination with forward observers, radio operators, and command posts scattered across the battlefield. The system was designed for precision and accountability. No artillery unit could fire without proper coordinates, verified targets, and authorization from higher command. It was a reasonable policy meant to prevent friendly fire incidents and ensure maximum effectiveness, in theory. In practice, it meant that Michael and his crew spent hours each day watching German positions through binoculars while waiting for permission to engage targets they could see clearly. They watched enemy supply convoys roll unmolested down mountain roads. They observed German artillery crews setting up new positions and registering their guns on American foxholes. They counted the muzzle flashes from enemy mortars that were tearing apart infantry units in the valley below. And they waited. They waited for radio calls that never came. They waited for coordinates that arrived too late. They waited for authorization that got lost in the maze of military bureaucracy while American soldiers died within sight of their position. The breaking point came on the morning of October 12th. Michael was cleaning his equipment when the radio crackled to life with desperate voices from the valley. Baker Company was pinned down in an exposed position, taking heavy casualties from German mortars positioned on Hill 394. The forward observer was dead. The radio operator was wounded, and the company commander was screaming for immediate fire support. Michael grabbed his field glasses and focused on Hill 394. There they were. 3 German mortar positions clearly visible, methodically dropping rounds on American troops who had nowhere to run. He could see the crew members moving around their weapons. He could see the ammunition stacks. He could even see the camouflage netting they had strung between the trees. He called it in immediately. Grid coordinates, target description, urgency level. Then he waited. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes. The radio remained silent except for increasingly desperate calls from Baker Company. 15 minutes, 20. Michael ran the calculations in his head. Range, 2,400 meters. Elevation, -3 degrees. Wind from the southwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. He had fired this mission dozens of times in training. He could put shells into a 10-meter circle at that distance without breaking a sweat. But he couldn't fire without authorization. That was the rule. That was the system. That was the difference between a professional army and an armed mob. Except the system was failing. The system was watching American soldiers die while paperwork got shuffled in command posts miles from the fighting. The system was more concerned with procedure than with results. Michael O'Malley made his choice. He turned to his gun crew, 3 young men who had been watching the same slaughter through their own field glasses. They knew what he was thinking before he said a word. They had been thinking the same thing. Michael looked at his crew. Corporal Tommy Martinez, barely 19 from a farm outside El Paso. Private First Class Danny Sullivan, a quiet kid from Maine who could load shells faster than anyone in the battalion. Private Joe Kowalski, a steel worker's son from Pittsburgh who had never missed a maintenance check in 8 months of combat. They had all seen the same thing through their scopes. They had all heard the same desperate radio calls, and they had all reached the same conclusion without a word being spoken. "Load high explosive," Michael said quietly. His voice was steady, almost conversational, as if he were ordering coffee instead of committing what could amount to mutiny. Martinez hesitated for just a moment. "Sarge, we don't have authorization." Michael adjusted the elevation wheel with practiced precision. "Baker Company is getting slaughtered down there, Tommy. We have clear targets, we have the range, we have the ammunition." He paused, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "What we don't have is time to wait for some staff officer to approve what we can see with our own eyes." Sullivan was already moving toward the ammunition rack. Kowalski began checking the breech mechanism. Martinez took his position at the site. They had drilled this sequence hundreds of times, but never under these circumstances, never in direct violation of standing orders. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. Michael had been calculating artillery solutions since Fort Sill, but this felt different. This wasn't practice. This wasn't a training exercise with cardboard targets and imaginary casualties. This was pure, distilled purpose. Every variable mattered. Every calculation had to be perfect the first time. He fact air-odd in the morning density, the slight crosswind from the valley, the temperature differential between his position and the target. His slide rule moved with mechanical precision, but his mind was already 3 steps ahead, visualizing the trajectory, the impact pattern, the effect on target. "Range 2,400, he called out. "Deflection right 020, charge 5, high explosive." The crew moved like clockwork. Sullivan hefted the 50-pound shell and slid it into the breech with practiced ease. Martinez fine-tuned the sight picture. Kowalski verified the charge and closed the breech with a solid metallic thunk that echoed across the hillside. Michael took one last look through his field glasses. The German mortar crews were still firing, still killing American soldiers with methodical efficiency, still operating under the assumption that they were safe from counter-battery fire because American artillery required authorization that would never come in time. They were about to learn otherwise. "Fire!" Michael said. The howitzer roared. The concussion wave rippled across the ridge, shaking loose rocks and sending a flock of ravens into panicked flight. The shells screamed upward in a perfect arc, carrying 43 pounds of high explosive, and one man's calculated fury toward Hill 394. Michael was already calling adjustments before the first round impacted. "Drop 100, right 50. He had seen the flash, heard the explosion, note-patterned the smoke. Close, but not perfect. In artillery, close was another word for useless. "Loading," Sullivan called. "Ready," Martinez confirmed. "Fire." The second shell was better, much better. It landed squarely in the middle of the German position, sending bodies and equipment flying in a devastating explosion that Michael could feel in his chest even at 2,000 meters distance. But he wasn't finished. Not even close. Through his glasses, he could see German soldiers scrambling for cover, abandoning their mortars, shouting orders that would never be heard over the ringing in their ears. What they couldn't see was that Michael O'Malley had spent months studying their positions, mapping their trenches, cataloguing their bunkers. He knew exactly where they would run. "Left 200, he called. "Add 50. That would put the next round directly on their communication trench, the covered pathway they used to move between positions. Fire. The third shell caught a dozen German soldiers in the open, trying to reach a secondary position. The explosion was spectacular, visible even without field glasses. A pillar of black smoke and orange flame that rose above the tree line like a monument to precision gunnery. By now, other American artillery crews were taking notice. Radio chatter buzzed with confusion and curiosity. Who was firing? What were the coordinates? Where was the authorization? Michael ignored it all. He was locked in now, working with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Each shell was placed with mathematical precision, each impact calculated to maximize destruction and prevent escape. Right 100, drop 75. That would hit the ammunition dump he had spotted 2 days earlier. Fire. The fourth shell triggered a secondary explosion that shook the entire hillside. German ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction that lit up the morning sky and sent shockwaves rolling across the valley like thunder. Even the German mortar fire stopped as crews ducked for cover or abandoned their positions entirely. Michael allowed himself a tight smile, but he wasn't done yet. Through his glasses, he could see movement in the tree line where the Germans had established their command post. Officers pointing, men running, radios being hastily packed. They were trying to coordinate a withdrawal, to salvage what they could from the sudden catastrophe that had engulfed their carefully prepared positions. Michael had other plans. Left 300, add 100. The command bunker was partially underground, reinforced with logs and sandbags. It would take a direct hit to crack it open. Fire. The fifth shell punched through the camouflage netting and detonated inside the bunker itself. The explosion was muffled but devastating, collapsing the entire structure and silencing the German radio traffic that had been coordinating defensive fire across the entire sector. Now the German positions were not just under attack. They were blind, leaderless, and trapped between American artillery above and American infantry advancing. Michael kept from below, firing, shell after shell, each one precisely placed, each one contributing to the systematic destruction of an entire defensive network that had taken the Germans weeks to establish. He hit supply trenches, observation posts, machine gun nests and mortar positions with the mechanical efficiency of a factory worker and the artistic precision of a master craftsman. His crew worked in perfect synchronization, loading and firing with a rhythm that had become almost hypnotic. They had found their groove, that perfect state where training and instinct merged into something approaching art. Sullivan's hands moved automatically, selecting shells and charges without conscious thought. Martinez tracked targets with the precision of a watchmaker. Kowalski maintained the weapon with religious devotion, ensuring that every shot would fire true. And still Michael kept firing, because this wasn't just about stopping the German mortars anymore. This was about something deeper, something that had been building inside him for months of watching good men die while bureaucrats shuffled papers. This was about the fundamental question that faced every soldier in every war. Do you follow orders, or do you do what's right? By the 15th shell, the German positions on Hill 394 had been transformed from a formidable defensive stronghold into a smoking crater field. But Michael O'Malley wasn't counting shells. He was counting lives. Every round that found its target meant fewer German mortars raining death on Baker Company. Every explosion that silenced an enemy gun was another American soldier who might make it home. The radio in his position had gone silent 20 minutes ago. No more desperate calls from the valley floor. No more screaming for fire support. Just the steady rhythm of his howitzer and the distant echoes of destruction rolling across the Italian hills. Through his field glasses, Michael watched German survivors stumbling through the smoke, their uniforms torn, their weapons abandoned. Some were helping wounded comrades, others were simply running, their nerve finally broken by the relentless precision of American artillery. A few hardy souls were still trying to return fire, but their shots were wild, desperate, the work of men who knew they were beaten. "Sarge," Martinez called softly. "Movement on the reverse slope. Looks like vehicles." Michael swung his glasses to the left. There, barely visible through the trees, he could make out the distinctive shapes of German trucks and half-tracks. They were trying to evacuate what remained of their forces, pulling back to secondary positions deeper in the mountains. It was a tactical withdrawal, professionally executed despite the chaos. Michael calculated quickly. The vehicles were moving along a mountain road that curved around the base of Hill 394. If he could time it right, place his shells at the correct points along that curve, he could catch the entire convoy in a devastating crossfire of steel and high explosive. But the math was more complex now. Moving targets required different calculations. He had to account for vehicle speed, road conditions, the time of flight for each shell. It was like shooting at ghosts, trying to hit something that wouldn't be there when the shell arrived. "Range 2,800. He called. "Deflection left 040. He paused, watching the convoy through his scope, timing their movement. "Time on target, 30 seconds, fire when ready." The shell arced high over the valley, its trajectory calculated to intercept the lead vehicle at a specific point on the mountain road. Michael was already adjusting for the second shot before the first one landed. "Add 200, left 020, fire." The timing was perfect. The first shell exploded directly in front of the lead truck, sending it careening off the road in a ball of flame. The second shell caught the middle of the convoy, destroying 2 vehicles and blocking the road with twisted metal and burning fuel. The remaining trucks tried to reverse to escape the trap, but they were caught on a narrow mountain path with nowhere to go. Michael methodically worked his way down the column, placing shells with surgical precision. Each explosion added to the chaos, turning an organized withdrawal into a panicked rout. German soldiers abandoned their vehicles and scattered into the forest, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and any hope of maintaining cohesive resistance in this sector. The destruction was so complete, so devastating that Michael almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then he remembered the American bodies he had helped carry off the battlefield the day before. He remembered the medics working frantically over wounded soldiers while German mortars continued to fall. He remembered the sound of Baker Company's radio calls, growing weaker and more desperate as their casualties mounted. His sympathy evaporated like morning mist. "Cease fire!" he finally called. The sudden silence was almost deafening after the continuous roar of the howitzer. His ears rang. His hands shook slightly from the adrenaline that was finally beginning to ebb. The acrid smell of cordite hung in the air like incense. Sullivan straightened up from the ammunition rack, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool mountain air. "How many rounds, Sarge?" Michael did a quick count of the empty shell casings scattered around their position. 23! 23 shells, each one fired without authorization, each one a potential court-martial charge, each one worth it. Kowalski was already checking the howitzer barrel, looking for signs of overheating or wear. The weapon had performed flawlessly, but sustained fire could stress even the best artillery piece beyond its limits. "She's running a little hot," he reported, "but still within specs." Martinez was scanning the target area through the sight, assessing the damage. "Jesus, Sarge. There's nothing left up there, just smoke and craters." Michael took one final look through his field glasses. Hill 394 was unrecognizable. What had been a carefully camouflaged defensive position was now a moonscape of shell holes and twisted metal. Smoke drifted from a dozen fires. Nothing moved except the occasional bird picking through the debris. But the real proof of their success wasn't visible from their position. It was the silence. No more German mortar fire echoing across the valley. No more desperate radio calls from American infantry pinned down by accurate artillery. The guns that had been killing American soldiers for 3 days were finally, permanently silent. The radio crackled back to life. "Charlie Battery, this is Thunder 6. Report your status immediately." "Thunder 6, Battalion Command." Michael recognized the voice of Colonel Harrison, a by-the-book officer who had never fired a shot in anger but could recite artillery regulations from memory. The man who would decide whether Michael O'Malley was a hero or a criminal. "Thunder 6, this is Charlie Battery," Michael replied, his voice steady. "Mission complete, targets destroyed." "Charlie Battery, I show no fire mission authorized for your position. Explain your actions immediately." There it was, the moment of truth. Michael could claim radio malfunction, misunderstood orders, any of a dozen excuses that might save his career. He could throw himself on the mercy of military bureaucracy and hope for understanding. Instead, he told the truth. "Thunder 6, Charlie Battery, engage targets of opportunity to support friendly forces in contact. No authorization received due to communication delays. Request immediate assessment of target area for battle damage evaluation." The radio went silent for a long moment. Michael could imagine the scene at battalion headquarters. Staff officers scrambling to check their records, trying to figure out who had authorized what. Radio operators confirming that no fire mission had been approved. Colonel Harrison realizing that one of his artillery crews had just conducted an unauthorized bombardment that probably violated half a dozen regulations. "Charlie Battery, remain in position. Assessment team route. And do not, repeat, do not conduct any further fire missions without explicit authorization." "Roger. Thunder 6, Charlie Battery standing by." Michael set down the radio handset and looked at his crew. They were watching him with expressions that mixed admiration, concern, and no small amount of fear. They all understood what had just happened. They had all participated in something that could end their military careers or worse. "Think they'll court-martial us, Sarge?" Sullivan asked quietly. Michael considered the question seriously. Military justice was swift and often harsh. Insubordination during wartime could result in anything from demotion to execution, depending on the circumstances and the mood of the court. He had violated direct orders, bypassed the chain of command, and conducted military operations without authorization. On the other hand, he had also destroyed an entire German defensive position eliminated a major threat to American forces and probably saved dozens of lives in the process. Results mattered in war, sometimes more than regulations. I don't know, he admitted, but I know this. Every man in Baker Company who's still breathing tonight is alive because we did our job. That's worth whatever happens next. The assessment team arrived 2 hours later, a collection of staff officers, intelligence specialists, and forward observers who climbed carefully through the ruins of Hill 394 with cameras, measuring devices, and clipboards. They spent the rest of the day cataloguing the destruction, interviewing survivors, and reconstructing exactly what had happened. Michael watched them work from his position on the ridge. He could see them pointing at shell craters, examining destroyed equipment, taking photographs of the devastation. Their body language told the story better than any official report could. Heads shaking in amazement, animated conversations, frequent glances back toward his position. As the sun began to set behind the Italian mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, a jeep wound its way up the mountain road toward Charlie Battery's position. Michael recognized the figure in the passenger seat even before the vehicle came to a stop. Colonel Harrison, come to deliver judgment personally. The colonel climbed out of the jeep slowly, his weathered face unreadable. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen artillery in action long before Michael O'Malley was born. He understood the weapon, understood its capabilities, understood what it took to use it effectively under combat conditions. He also understood military discipline and the importance of following orders. "Staff Sergeant O'Malley," he said formally, "walk with me." They moved away from the gun position, out of earshot of the crew. The colonel stopped at a point where they could see both the destroyed German positions and the valley below, where American forces were already advancing through areas that had been death traps just hours before. 23 rounds, the colonel said without preamble. No authorization, no fire mission, no coordination with other units. He paused, studying the devastation through his own field glasses. Complete destruction of a reinforced German defensive position. Estimated enemy casualties, 147 killed, wounded, or missing. Michael said nothing. There was nothing to say. The facts spoke for themselves. The intelligence boys estimate the position had been responsible for over 60 American casualties in the past week alone, the colonel continued, including 12 men from your own battery who were killed trying to take that hill 3 days ago. Still, Michael remained silent. He had known those 12 men personally, had shared cigarettes with them, played cards with them, written letters home for those who couldn't write well themselves. Their deaths had been eating at him for days, a constant reminder of the cost of caution in a war where hesitation killed. "You violated standing orders," Colonel Harrison said finally. "You acted without authorization. You bypassed the chain of command and conducted military operations based solely on your own judgment." Michael braced himself for what was coming. Court-martial, demotion, prison, perhaps even execution, depending on how seriously the army wanted to make an example of him. "You also," the colonel continued, "displayed exactly the kind of initiative, tactical awareness, and professional competence that wins wars." Michael felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The colonel's words hung in the cool mountain air like smoke from the howitzer barrel. This wasn't the conversation he had expected. This wasn't the beginning of his court-martial. "Sir, I take full responsibility for the actions of my crew," Michael said carefully. "They were following my orders." Colonel Harrison waved a dismissive hand. "Your crew isn't the issue here, Sergeant. The issue is that you did something today that most officers wouldn't have the balls to attempt. You saw a tactical situation developing, you calculated the risks, and you acted decisively while other units were still waiting for permission to breathe." The colonel pulled out a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. "I just got off the radio with General Morrison at division headquarters. He wants to know how one artillery crew managed to accomplish what an entire infantry regiment couldn't do in 3 days of fighting." Michael glanced at the paper, recognizing the format of an official military communication. His fate was probably written somewhere in those typed lines and official stamps. The General has 3 options for dealing with your unauthorized actions, Colonel Harrison continued. Option 1, court-martial you for insubordination and make an example that will ensure no other artillery crew ever thinks about firing without proper authorization. Option 2, quietly transfer you to a rear initiative echelon unit where you won't cause any more paperwork headaches. Option 3, promote you to section chief and give you more guns to command. The silence stretched between them. In the distance, Michael could hear his crew cleaning the howitzer, their voices low and tense. They were probably wondering if they would all be sharing the same prison cell by morning. "What's it going to be, sir?" Michael asked. Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time since arriving. It transformed his weathered face, revealing the combat veteran beneath the staff officer exterior. "Section Chief it is. You'll take command of Bravo Section tomorrow morning. 4 guns, 16 men, and explicit authorization to engage targets of opportunity whenever you deem it tactically necessary." Michael stared at him. "Sir, the Army needs more men who can think for themselves when the situation demands it. What you did today saved American lives and eliminated a major threat to our advance. That matters more than procedure." The colonel handed him the paper. "Your promotion orders, effective immediately. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Malley never became a famous general. His name doesn't appear in history textbooks or military academies. But on that October morning in 1943, when bureaucracy failed and good men were dying, he proved something fundamental about warfare. Sometimes victory doesn't come from following orders. Sometimes it comes from a soldier who understands that saving lives matters more than saving face. 23 unauthorized shells, 147 enemy casualties, 0 American losses. And a reminder that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers through the mathematics of war, calculated by men who refuse to let others die while they wait for permission to act.